December 7th, 1941. A cold winter night settled over the English countryside as Winston Churchill sat inside his study at Chequers, the Prime Minister's rural retreat. The war had already dragged on for more than 2 brutal years.
He is a warrior first, so he understands war.
London still bore the raw, blackened scars of the Blitz. The British Empire was stretched thin, rationing was tightening, and every day brought a new test of endurance. And then, late in the evening, a call came in. Urgent, unexpected. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Churchill froze, and for a moment, the room seemed to fall completely silent around him. The Japanese strike meant something extraordinary, something he had prayed for, argued for, and maneuvered toward since the first dark months of 1940. The United States could no longer remain neutral. That night, as he later wrote, he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. It wasn't joy, it wasn't celebration, it was relief. Immense, almost overwhelming relief. Because Churchill knew that America's entrance into the war would change everything. But that realization would become something far more powerful months later, when he stood on a London street and watched long columns of young American soldiers march past him. In that moment, Churchill understood not just that America had joined the war, but that the Allies would win it. For Churchill, America's entry into the war wasn't just welcome. It was the culmination of an exhausting, almost desperate campaign he had been waging since the earliest days of his premiership. When France collapsed in June 1940, Britain stood utterly alone. The Nazi war machine dominated Europe, U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and nightly bombings hammered British cities. Many in the British government doubted that help would come in time. Churchill refused to accept that. He believed deep in his bones that the English-speaking democracies must stand together. But belief wasn't enough. The United States was deeply isolationist, wounded by the First World War, and skeptical of becoming entangled in another European conflict. So Churchill worked relentlessly to tug America closer, sometimes with diplomacy, sometimes with charm, sometimes with outright pleas. His correspondence with President Franklin Roosevelt became legendary. Over 1,700 messages exchanged during the course of the war. These weren't dry diplomatic notes. They were personal, strategic, emotional, sometimes even humorous. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt as both a leader and a friend, making the case that Hitler was not just Europe's threat, but the world's. Lend-Lease, passed in early 1941, felt like a breakthrough. American weapons, food, and supplies began to flow across the Atlantic. But Churchill knew it still wasn't enough. Material support could keep Britain alive, but it couldn't win the war. Only American manpower, American factories, and American resolve could tip the balance. Every message Churchill sent carried the same unspoken hope. Come in, join us, help us end this nightmare. The breakthrough Churchill had been waiting for came suddenly, violently, and far from Europe. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, pulling the United States into a war it had tried hard to avoid. For Americans, it was a day of shock and fury. For Churchill, it was the moment he had predicted and feared and needed. Within hours, he made his decision. He would go to Washington personally. If the United States was finally stepping into the ring, Churchill wanted to be standing at Roosevelt's side. The days that followed were some of the most dramatic diplomatic hours in modern history. On December 8th, America declared war on Japan. By December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, triggering America's full entry into the global conflict. What had once been a distant theoretical alliance suddenly became real. Churchill flew across the Atlantic, through dangerous U-boat zones, to the White House. For 3 weeks, he and Roosevelt worked almost non-stop, eating Christmas dinner together, planning combined operations, discussing a global strategy. They laid the foundations for what would become the most powerful military partnership in history. And yet, for all the meetings and handshakes, there was something missing. America was now in the war, but it was still a distant presence. There were no US soldiers in Europe yet, no boots on British soil. The alliance existed on paper and in spirit, but not in flesh and blood. That would change in just a few weeks. The alliance became unmistakably real on January 26, 1942. On that cold winter morning, the first contingent of American troops, units of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, stepped onto the docks of Northern Ireland. Their arrival marked the first time in history that American soldiers had been stationed in Europe before a major campaign. More transports followed, and by the end of 1942, Nearly 100,000 American troops were spread across the British Isles. The numbers kept rising, hundreds of thousands more in 1943, and eventually more than 1.5 million by the time D-Day approached. It was one of the largest troop movements in world history. Their presence was impossible to ignore. The Americans arrived well-fed, well-equipped, and wearing crisp new uniforms. Their rations were luxurious by British standards: cigarettes, chocolate, meat, sugar. To war-weary civilians living on strict rationing, they seemed almost unreal. The cultural contrast produced jokes, tensions, and fascination. The most famous British saying was half bitter and half amused: "They're overpaid, oversexed, and over here." Yet beneath the teasing, something deeper moved through the country. The sight of these confident, energetic young Americans brought something Britain hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The moment that would stay with Churchill for the rest of his life came a few months later, when he learned that American troops would be marching in formal parade through London. He insisted immediately that he would be there in person. No speeches, no ceremony. He simply wanted to witness it with his own eyes. The day arrived gray and cold, the kind of heavy London afternoon where the clouds feel only a few feet above the rooftops. Bomb scars still marked the city: gutted houses, shattered windows, entire blocks left as charred skeletons. But along the parade route, Londoners gathered anyway. Families stood on stoops, factory workers hung out of upper windows, and children waved tiny paper American flags. Then the sound came: drums, boots, the rhythmic beat of military precision. Column after column of young American soldiers marched through the heart of the battered city. They were tall, confident, and healthy, so different from the exhausted British troops who had been fighting non-stop since 1939. Their uniforms were spotless, their equipment gleamed, their energy filled the streets. Churchill stood watching, his face tightening with emotion. Witnesses said he blinked rapidly, struggling to control himself. And then he said quietly, almost to himself, "When I see these young men, I know we are going to win this war." It wasn't a political line, and it wasn't meant for cameras. It was the voice of a man finally allowed to believe in victory. To understand why that parade struck Churchill so deeply, you have to understand the weight he'd been carrying since 1940. For 2 full years, Britain's survival rested almost entirely on his shoulders. Every night during the Blitz, he watched London burn. Every morning he read casualty lists, telegrams from sinking ships, and intelligence reports warning of invasion. Behind his fierce public speeches was a man stretched to the breaking point. So when those American troops marched through London, it wasn't just a military display. It was a moment of emotional release, something Churchill had not allowed himself to feel since taking office. For the first time, the burden was shared. Strategically, the implications were immense. America brought manpower on a scale Hitler could never match, factories capable of producing weapons faster than they could be destroyed, and a population united in anger and determination. With the United States fully committed, the war shifted from a fight for survival to a fight for victory. But on a personal level, what Churchill felt was certainty. Not hope, not potential, certainty. The young Americans marching past him were living proof that the tide had turned. Britain was no longer alone, and Hitler's defeat was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. After that parade, Churchill made it a personal mission to visit American bases all across Britain. He didn't go for publicity, and he rarely brought news cameras. He went because he wanted to meet the men whose presence had changed the gravity of the war. He walked through muddy training grounds, inspected barracks, and toured motor pools. At each stop, he made a point of talking directly with the troops. Texans with their slow drawls, New Yorkers with their sharp humor, Midwestern farm boys who had never left the United States before boarding a troop ship. Churchill shook hands, asked questions, joked with them, and thanked them. He told them they were not just fighting for Britain or for Europe, but for the future of freedom itself. For many of the young soldiers, seeing the British Prime Minister standing in front of them, coat blowing in the wind, cigar in hand, was a moment they never forgot. These visits weren't just symbolic. They reassured American troops that they were welcome, they strengthened morale, and they reinforced the idea that the United States and Britain were fighting not as distant allies, but as partners, side by side, equal in sacrifice and purpose. Churchill understood something simple but powerful. Alliances aren't won on paper, they're won face to face. America's arrival didn't just boost morale, it reshaped the entire course of the war. With US troops and industry now fully engaged, the Allies could finally go on the offensive. In 1942 and 1943, American forces joined the British in North Africa, helping turn the tide at battles like El Alamein and driving the Axis out of the desert. From there came the invasions of Sicily and Italy, pushing Hitler's armies back toward the continent's heart. Meanwhile, millions of tons of American supplies poured into Britain, everything needed to build the largest invasion force in history. By 1944, American and British troops stood shoulder to shoulder on the shores of Normandy. This was the foundation of what Churchill later called the special relationship. The grey afternoon in London became more than a parade. It was the symbolic turning point of the entire war. For 2 years, Churchill had fought with grit, fury, and sheer will, but always under the shadow of possible defeat. Watching those young Americans march past, he finally allowed himself to breathe. The burden was no longer his alone. Victory was no longer a hope. It was a promise. And in that moment, Churchill believed it completely.